G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Poll Position, our fortnightly show where we unpack the big political issues and dive into the latest results from the Guardian Essential Poll. Before we start, Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. It's a bit of an overcast, awful day here today, but a beautiful one nonetheless. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, to the traditional owners, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As you know, days and times for our webinars do vary, so please head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au/events to register. Don't forget to register for tomorrow's launch of our annual Climate of the Nation report. It's the country's longest running continuous survey of attitudes to climate change. It's going to be launched by the Shadow Minister, Chris Bowen. That's tomorrow at 11 a.m. And again, details are on our website. Just a few tips before we begin to make sure everything runs smoothly. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our panel, upvote questions from other people and comment on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and will go up on our website and our YouTube channel afterwards if you have to step out for any reason. So we are just weeks away from the Glasgow Climate Summit and we're witnessing several Damascene conversions to the cause of net zero emissions by 2050. News Corp has had several front page splashes extolling the job opportunities of a clean energy future this week. The BCA has endorsed a 2030 target just 2 years after a less ambitious target than what they're advocating now. They described as economy wrecking, and you know, all this as the Nationals have been floating ideas like jacking up the mortgages of every Australian and a $250 billion loan facility to keep coal and gas companies afloat. So there's a lot happening in climate politics, and I haven't even mentioned the fact that New South Wales has a new premier and restrictions are lifting. They've had their so-called Freedom Day there. So yeah, a lot happening in politics overall. And to discuss all this and more, I'm delighted to welcome back our regular panellist, Katharine Murphy, political editor at Guardian Australia, and Pete Lewis, executive director at Essential Media, Richie Merzian, the director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, and John Remington from Essential as well. Welcome, everyone. Katharine, as always, I'll start with you. I mean, just nothing ever happens in politics.
I get first go at what a time, Eb, do I? Yes, what a time to be alive, as a former Prime Minister was fond of saying. Yes, look, it's certainly been a lively fortnight. The New South Wales government basically fell apart and reconstituted itself in real time. Then in the federal arena, as you say, we're kind of limping or sprinting or jeting, I'm not really sure what we're doing, in the direction of a pre-Glasgow climate policy. Basically, for people interested in this issue, we've gone from the sort of preamble to the substantive negotiation within the government now this week. That is what is playing out this week. The leadership group plus a bunch of Nats ministers got the first look at Angus Taylor's roadmap yesterday afternoon. It will go to Cabinet on Wednesday, and there will be a meeting of the National Party Room on Sunday before Parliament resumes and we roll back into Coalition Party Room and other things next week. So yeah, it's an important week for the climate, and an important week in the life of this government. You know, can Scott Morrison manage to put anything even halfway decent on the table? Well, I guess we'll find out over the next few days. And also in terms of, you know, in the background, and we'll get into this obviously when we get into the numbers, the sort of faceplant and reconstitution of the New South Wales government has also kick-started the sort of national conversation about integrity commissions and the merits thereof. But anyway, that we'll get into that once we start to hit the numbers.
Yeah, so Pete, we'll dive into the slides in just a minute, but I know your op-ed has just gone up in the Guardian, and for anyone who's interested in the slides and things for today, do head on over to Guardian Australia. Katharine's write-up is already up and available there, and you can find Pete's piece as well. But Pete, I think you've coined a new term in today's op-ed, the bullshit industrial complex. What was that all about?
Well, on one level, it's about exactly what Katharine's been talking about, the excitement coming out of the Murdoch press for actual something that looks a little bit like something that isn't denying climate action. The business lobby changing their stripes as well, and obviously the Prime Minister trying to land something that at least provides the veneer. Most people looking at this dispassionately, and I'm sure Richie will reinforce this, is 2050 by zero by 2050 is really just a bullshit policy, let's face it. But there's been this other thing that's going on, which is probably with my hat with the Centre for Responsible Technology I've been looking at closely, which is the real-time collapse of Facebook's social license. And it just struck me that, you know, climate is a great proof point of what happens where you've got a technology that is really powered by bullshit being fed by media companies that are desperate for audience and reach, plus politicians who'll do whatever it takes to win. And that's what we get. And we get a decade of inaction on climate change as an output of this business model that's driven the largest companies on earth. And it is fascinating to watch the same guys that have been driving the climate bullshit now in terms of Morrison and Joyce saying we're going to come and regulate the tech giants, which feels to me a bit like miners saying we need to act on climate change. And I'm personally supportive of any measures to hold the platforms more strongly to account, but the whole thing just creates a mind map that kind of does blow your brains. So anyway, I've tried to lay that out in a little bit in a few steps. So linking climate with integrity with the regulation of big tech. So there's a bit of a journey for us all to go on then.
Yeah, well, how about we get into the polling results? Let's see. Is that working for everyone?
Yeah, that was very smooth.
Excellent. So obviously we've got here a question about targets to begin with. Pete, if you want to just take us through these quickly.
We were really keen just to really clearly get a sense of what people want to see from their government and laid out the three options that appear to be on the table, which is a target that is more ambitious for 2030, just settling for net zero by 2050, or no target at all. And you can see the numbers there. I think Katharine in her piece today combined the 43 and the 25 to say the overwhelming majority of Australians want to see something happen. The reality is that 43% of those want to see a lot more than net zero by 2050. And, you know, younger voters, more progressive voters, obviously, but also a fair whack of coalition voters. Which then plays off these two, we've been running these two long-term trend lines way back to November 2009 now. Wow, that is a long journey, isn't it? And belief in the causes of climate, it's happening and it's caused by human activity. We're just witnessing a normal fluctuation in the Earth's climate, or dunno. And you can see again the way that debate has waxed and waned. 59% going with the science is where we are at the moment, about double the number of people who are just saying nothing to see here. And this is the other long-term benchmark, doing enough, not doing enough. So doing enough, 31%, which kind of reflects that previous figure. Doing too much, 15%, which has gone up a little bit since we asked that last time in June, and not doing enough, down a little bit. So there is a little bit of noise on the edges, but even within that, it does make total political sense what the Prime Minister's trying to land, even if we do say it's purely incremental.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through these next couple of slides and then we'll come back to the
There's a
discussion.
lot going on in these numbers, people.
Yeah,
I'm
there's a
sure
lot,
Richie and
yeah.
Katharine can do a lot with this. We also want to see the salience of the issue. So 22% say this is the most important issue. John maybe can put in chat if there are any obvious groups that are saying that. 45% say it's very important, but there are other issues that equally concern me. And again, that kind of 2/3 of the population saying this is really important, which reflects the previous slides. 20% somewhat important, but there's other things going around. 7% not that, and 6% bit. So 13% just don't want to even know about it.
And this was the one that I found really interesting. There's clearly, a lot of support here for the opportunities of climate action.
Yeah, and these are testing some positive messages, basically. And when you put the arguments forward, the vast majority of people go with you. So whether you're saying it's an opportunity for business to develop expertise, 64% tick, manufacturing benefit from cheap electricity, tick, Australia needs to follow other countries' lead, 57% tick, and the risk of being locked out of markets, tick again. So it's kind of a win across the board there.
Yeah.
What does it say? It says it's almost like it's not even a contentious debate. The only point at which it feels a bit like anti-vaxxing, like the voices against it are fringe but loud, but the vast majority just want the government to get on to do it. I think the big political question is whether 2050 zero is enough, and the numbers there suggest probably not.
Katharine, I want to come back to you. Obviously, you wrote up the results today, but was there anything that really stuck out to you in these results as different, or kind of an intensification of feelings on anything?
Well, it's sort of, I think as Pete says, it sort of underscores a long-term trend in terms of where the majority of Australians are at with climate action. It's interesting to see too on that. I did, as Pete said, combine those two percentages just for ease of understanding in the copy this morning, right? So that we've got a majority north of 60% who want action, but it's actually front end loaded, which is interesting. People want something serious by 2030. But as in all of these conversations, Ed, the only thing I would say to this audience is that while there is a majority who favour climate action and a growing number of people who favour early climate action rather than deferred climate action, we do need to understand that in that sort of basic question, that basic proposition is, are humans contributing to warming or not? Or are we just watching a cyclical event? There's still 30% of the country that thinks we're just watching a cyclical event. And the point why we haven't been able to get climate action in the past is the distribution of those people across Australia. So even though we are now very clearly on our polling and on pretty much every polling I've seen, looking at a clear majority of Australians in favour of climate action, we are also looking at a minority of Australians who either think this is a complete beat up or who are not necessarily possessed with the idea that we need to act urgently. So I think both of those things always need to be borne in mind, because it explains, it explains why we're here. It explains where we are.
Yeah, I can see we've got 730 odd people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Richie, I'm going to come to you next. Katharine was talking there about, we've still got a sizable minority there who have some doubts, but politically speaking, there's a very vocal minority in the parliament. We're seeing the government trying to kind of inch forward towards some kind of a net zero target, but the majority of the public is looking for something sooner than that. And then we've got the Nationals out there with, a $250 billion loan for the mining industry. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of weeks?
That is a tough question. I think at the end of the day, we'll land on net zero by 2050 as a policy position. won't be locked into legislation. It won't necessarily be accountable. It won't necessarily have interim targets. It'll have a number of caveats and loopholes, but it'll be sufficient to take to Glasgow politically for the Prime Minister. It certainly won't be sufficient for what the UK is asking for as the COP president, which is short-term action, increasing your nationally determined contributions, consigning coal power to history. That's what's actually on the menu for the policy options for the international community. It's increasing 2030 targets, it's phasing out fossil fuels. Bringing a weak 2050 target, an unaccountable one, I think is a dangerous play internationally, but a safe play domestically. And I think that's where we'll end up. But the other thing as well, the Nationals don't just have to contend with a very loud minority around this $250 billion mining fund, but also potential compensation for land use changes to farmers over the last 30 years, which I actually think is a more legitimate claim than $250 billion for coal mining, because for the last 30 years, Australia has basically called on land use changes to meet its emissions reductions whilst emissions grew in the industrial sector, in the electricity sector, in transport. So basically, yes, off land use changes, we have become more carbon heavy as an economy. And really, we should be thinking about how we put pressure on those parts of the economy. It's interesting that it's coming now from the farming sector in the form of compensation now.
Yeah. Katharine, I wanted to come back to you. We heard the NFF out this week around those carbon credits generated from Kyoto. But we've also seen, as I said at the beginning, the BCA kind of backflip, do a complete 180 on their stance from just 2 years ago. News Corp is, running a couple of nice front pages for a change. Is this all just to give kind of cover for the Morrison government leading up to some type of announcement, or are we seeing a genuine shift forced upon people because the rest of the world takes it seriously?
Well, if you're, I'm sorry, it's just it does it does your head in, really, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest. But anyway, pressing on in orderly fashion, it's a little bit of both, Ed, I think is the truth. It's a little bit of both. The principal thing that's moved the business community between 45% being an economy wrecking target literally 5 minutes ago and now is investor pressure. The Business Council positions itself where it thinks the interests of its members lie. Previously, that has been in delaying climate action. Now it is basically maximising it. So that explains the BCA's position. In terms of the news, well, what do you say? But it's very interesting, though, isn't it? Because certainly from the point of view of Nationals, they're very intrigued by the amount of muscle that the Liberals are trying to bring to bear on this negotiation. That basically, there's the BCA's position, there'll be other business voices out, there's a full court press from News Corp. The Nats are sitting in the middle of all of this thinking, well, God, Morrison's got a bit of a problem, hasn't he? If all of these pressures are being brought to bear in order to sort of corral them into a landing point. And that is genuinely fascinating. I think, look, the BCA, if anyone watched Insiders at the weekend, you'll know I had a rage moment, which I'm still processing. But anyway, look, better late than never, guys. Thanks for nothing. Glad you're finally here. In terms of news, I think the test sort of going forward, because sort of to your essential point, Ed, which is this real or is this political management? Well, News Corporation has been facing the same pressure that many other corporations have been facing from investors and others to, be less retrograde in terms of its positioning on climate change, both in this country and certainly in the US. So again, News Corp is facing the same investor pressure, the commercial pressure that every other corporation is facing. So it's partly that. There's been a schism in the family. James Murdoch left the company. There's been all kinds of, serious business going down in News Corp about their disposition towards climate action. But I think the real test of whether or not this news operation has finally grappled with science, economics, and reason will be whether or not, if there are differences between the major parties between now and the next federal election, if, say, Scott Morrison lands a 2050 target, but doesn't increase the ambition of Australia's 2030 target, but Labor goes to the next election with a higher 2030 target than the government, what does News say? Is climate action great depending on, are they neutral about who delivers climate action, or are some people delivering climate action okay, but others not? And I think that really is the key test about whether or not this company has turned a corner.
And Katharine, I can't move on without asking you, as a long-time watcher, about this Keith Pitt idea for $250 billion. I mean, is that just an ambit claim to make some kind of a $50 billion commitment seem reasonable by comparison? Or does he really think that's what, the coal and gas sector need? Is that how much trouble the coal and gas sector is in?
Well, it's sort of, it's obviously extraordinary. And it was sort of a relief that Pitt's Nationals colleagues weren't falling over one another to endorse it either, because the scale of it is genuinely Venezuelan. So, thank God. But anyway, no, look, the problem is, I don't know what particular concessions the Nats will emerge with, apart from the obvious concessions that the fossil fuel industry will get from this transition, i.e., they'll have a net zero roadmap with heavy use of offsets, heavy use of technology that the fossil fuel industry favours, like CCS and other things, right? Like, they're already going to get a pretty good deal. I don't know what else will emerge as the price for the Nats signing on. But the problem, in fairness, right, obviously the proposal is ludicrous, but in fairness to Keith Pitt and his colleagues, the problem they have is that in 2019, they went to voters, their voters in Queensland, the voters in regional Queensland, and they told them that the National Party was all the way with fossil fuels and nothing ever needed to change, that it was all going to be the same forever. End of story. We, the Nationals, will make sure that happens. Now, not 3 years later, these same Queensland Nats have to turn up again at home and say, actually, we're going to do net zero by 2050. Politically, that is a really difficult position for these people to be in. Now, of course, I would say they shouldn't have said what they said in 2019. That's like simple. Shouldn't have said what you said in 2019. Wouldn't have a problem now. But the fact is, they said it. So now they have to try and square a circle that looks very difficult to square. And in terms of the whole financing of thermal coal and other things, sorry, I'm hogging the mic, I'll get to the point. Pitt's been on about this for a bit in terms of banks not lending to propositions that they now think, are too carbon risky, basically to back or to book. He's been on about this for months. He's had a whole inquiry trying to turn this around. So this is a long-term bugbear for him. I think he wants some sort of situation where the government becomes lender of last resort, so that if some thermal coal operation comes along that they want to develop, that it can be developed. Anyway, that's too much information, but yeah. You asked, Deb. Sorry.
I did. No, and we'll just get back to the integrity kind of questions that have been thrown up by the departure of Gladys Berejiklian. But Richie, just coming back to you quickly before we get on to that, while we wrap up climate, before we move on. How big is that pressure from investors in the short term, as a lot of other countries are lifting their ambition for 2030?
Yeah, it's a legitimate pressure. They're not moving out of altruism. They're moving because it's not a good investment. And right now, Australia is one of the few places that's dragging its heels in terms of making these changes. But these changes are already on foot. the UK, and London being a center of capital, is going to play a major role at COP26 and some of the announcements around the implementation of climate risk disclosure, but then also the actual movement of finance. It's worth remembering that the Paris Agreement has 3 targets. The first around emissions reductions, the second around adapting to the unavoidable impacts, the third is actually around aligning finance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's going to play a major role. And it's one of the few areas that the UK can actually flex as a financial capital of the world. And so really, this is a serious consideration. And it's worth just mentioning something my colleague Rod Campbell said. For $250 billion, you can buy the entire coal industry. So really, we should be thinking about nationalizing it and then shutting it down. Like, we could put everyone on a lifetime pension at their current salary. For that much money, you could do so many other things than just simply back in an industry that is going to wind down anyway.
Thanks, Richie. We'll go back now to the slides here. So support for a federal ICAC, Pete. Obviously, this is back on the agenda because Gladys Berejiklian chose to resign in the wake of news that New South Wales ICAC was investigating her again in relation to her secret relationship with Darren Maguire and whether or not she had acted improperly in making decisions around grants and other things. I think those hearings are due to begin perhaps next week. But you've looked here at support for a federal ICAC. Take us through these numbers.
We've been canvassing a federal ICAC since September 2018, which has been when the debate sort of was first sparked. It's been a bit like world peace. The vast majority of people think it's a good thing. There's been a tiny drop off this time around, but not statistically significant, as you can see there. It's been in the low 80s all the way through, and it's 79, I think, this time, or 78. Little uptick in the number of people opposing it, and we'll see in the next slide. Interestingly, not a huge shift. So for those that aren't in New South Wales, this has really been used as justification of why we can't have a federal ICAC, because you'll lose people like St. Gladys. The fact that she has not yet given the evidence, and the fact that she's also already being tapped to run for a federal seat, notwithstanding, the Prime Minister has really been jumping on the back of, look what ICACs can do if we don't get it right, to justify the slow walk and the minimalist approach that they're taking, right? So 47% of people say it makes them more likely to support an anti-corruption body, 21% less. John, I think that was up to 28 in New South Wales who are less likely. So there is a cohort that aren't glad that she's gone and blame ICAC for it, but it is not really shifting the needle significantly.
And I thought this was interesting too, just in the context, trust in institutions.
Yeah, so we had a little bit of a narrative running last year, Katharine and I, that trust in institutions had gone up last year through our, national staycation. It dropped off a bit, and it's continued to drop off on the states and the feds, but I just think that's because of the second wave of lockdown. We previously hadn't put in scientific bodies and universities. I actually think just 59% saying they trust universities is pretty alarming, to be honest with you. And scientific bodies at 68%. So again, it's the same. It's kind of the same numbers, actually, if you sort of do that lineup that want action on climate, about 2/3 of the population. So, there is 2/3 of us, are truth-based. That's a good thing. I'm just concerned about the other third. And just in terms of the other third, this is fascinating, and John pulled this together for us. Just pulling out the other. So when we ask questions about all these issues, we also have a voting intention question, so we can break it into Labor, Coalition, Green, and other. Now, other is a mixture of One Nation, UAP, independents, and I think we've still got Katter as an option in Queensland, right? So it is kind of, I think of it as the right flank, although I think with the rise of the Climate 200 independents, we'll have to rethink that. The problem is it's a pretty small cohort because it's less than 10% of the population, but they just stand out as having different views on a lot of things. For example, while 4% of the rest of Australia say that they will never get vaccinated, 17% of the others say so. While 30% of the general population say we're just witnessing normal fluctuation, 47% of those that are sending their vote to the right flank say nothing to see here. And again, on science, there was a significant difference. While 23% of us in general say we have a lot, some trust in scientific bodies, 36% in the minor parties. That must just be the lot though, John. I might just get you to sort of tell me if I've messed up that last piece there. But the general, these are not like the rest of us, and they are a very powerful constituent that sits on the right flank of the coalition and interrupts any attempt they've got to govern to the centre.
Yeah, actually, I think I might have messed up that last one. It's in every case, there's less trust amongst minor parties than all others in the scientific bodies. And that's the case when from that earlier slide where we asked about federal governments, state governments, universities, health authorities, in all cases, just less trust amongst those voters for minor parties.
Yeah. So I want to go back to integrity commissions because, I mean, the Australia Institute's been trying to get up the case for a federal ICAC nationally for, I think, since about 2015. So, I mean, we're closer than we've ever been before, but it still seems quite far away. I did think it was really interesting, Katharine, that the Prime Minister jumped on the love for Gladys Berejiklian that a lot of people have in New South Wales and really used that as a way to undermine the New South Wales ICAC, even though it hasn't even held the hearings yet, even though ICAC didn't sack her or force her to resign. That was her own standard that she had set for other ministers. I mean, the coalition has not been in a great rush to legislate its own weak form of a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, but the independents in Parliament, the Greens have always backed strongly the need for a federal ICAC, and Labor has been very strong too over the past couple of years. Is this something we're going to see a real push for in the last couple of weeks of Parliament?
I think we expect that the government's bill will return. As for whether or not it can be successfully legislated, well, as you said, Ed, the principal problem with it is that it's not a good model, that what the Commonwealth's putting forward, right? There is a legitimate debate about integrity commissions being kangaroo courts and all of that sort of stuff. That's fine. That's a completely reasonable debate that one can have about that. But in terms of the Commonwealth proposal, we've seen this massive overcorrection to that, to the extent where they're advancing a model which really, won't be able to get to the bottom of anything. Its remit's very narrow, and the standard for it being able to launch an investigation is also very high. So anyway, in terms of the Parliament, yep, we expect it to come back. As you said, most of the other actors in the Parliament, apart from the government, want a stronger integrity commission than the one the government's proposing. So we could see the government's proposal being amended. And then it's a matter of a choice for Labor, I suppose, whether or not they don't insist on their amendments on the basis that something's better than nothing and you can always ratchet up something, or whether they just say, look, no, that's just a joke. We'll see at the election on this. So I'm not quite sure where that will land, but that's the two propositions.
Yeah, and just for anyone who is interested in the flaws that are associated with the government's proposed Commonwealth Integrity Commission, you can head on over to the Australia Institute website. We've got extensive research on that, but basically the main concerns are it's got a really high threshold for any investigations. It has to be a criminal matter, and as we can see in the Victorian IBAC that's currently happening at the moment around branch stacking, for example, is not criminal or illegal. So it's exactly the kind of thing that would not be investigated. investigated under the Commonwealth's proposed model. It wouldn't have the ability to hold public hearings, at least for politicians, staffers and public servants. There would be public hearings for law enforcement officers. And we know a lot of judges and the High Court have even talked about how important public hearings are to ensure that justice is not only done but seen to be done, and for example to encourage people to come forward as whistleblowers. That's another flaw with it. It can't accept referrals from or complaints from whistleblowers. So there's a lot of problems with the government's proposed model that's really seen by a lot of experts as just a bit of a shield for politicians, their staff and the public servants, while there's much lower thresholds for investigations for law enforcement and other bodies. But as Katharine said, there is concerns to be managed around protection of reputations and things like that. But I do encourage you to look at some of the critiques from the Australia Institute's National Integrity. That's a body of retired judges who've done a lot of work into what a well-designed anti-corruption commission looks like. Did anyone else want to jump in on integrity commissions there, or we might go to questions from the audience? I can see we've got 760 people on the line with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Might come back to a couple of the slides on leadership towards the end, but a lot to get through here. The first question is from Mel Smith, and it touches on another big issue that's happened in the last week or so. They ask, should recipients of Australian of the Year award be allowed to speak their mind? Grace Tame has been accused of being partisan by Janet Albrighton and The Australian. Thoughts from the panel? Katharine, I might come to you first on that one.
I'd sort of spared myself, I gave myself a sanity break on the weekend and I didn't actually read that piece. I know that there was a lot of discussion about it. Well, it's silly, isn't it? I mean, obviously, Grace Tame was awarded Australian of the Year because of her excellent work with survivors. That was the reason she won Australian of the Year, was awarded that honour. She made it clear from the moment she was in receipt of the honour that she intended to use her platform. And she's done that, I think, in a highly effective way, sort of elevating this issue very much to national consciousness. And, the personal is political, but it's not automatically partisan just because you don't like the views you're hearing or because you think someone's not being appropriately deferential or whatever the charge is. I mean, the thing I admire most about women of Grace Tame's generation is their utter unwillingness to be co-opted by institutions. And that's why she's been a very effective public advocate. So, perhaps I'm doing Janet a disservice because I haven't read her piece and Janet can sometimes write a very good piece, but I just saw the headlines and I saw the ensuing outrage and I thought, you know what, I might just sit in my garden rather than read that.
Well, I don't think you've done Janet a disservice there. I think you've probably hit the nail on the head. I did read the piece and it just strikes me that every year we seem to appoint people who are outspoken and effective in their advocacy. And then when they keep advocating for their cause, we just get really annoyed with
It's a strange process. I don't entirely understand it, yes.
But yeah, it did seem to be getting to this idea that if you're Australian of the Year, somehow you shouldn't be able to criticise the government because that is partisan. And I think that it goes to your point. Critique is not necessarily partisan, depending on who's in the government. The next question that we've got here is from Jonathan Nolan. It says, is Morrison's plan to announce a 50% target but not go to Glasgow? This is a long one, but claim he is doing something meaningful even when he is not. An excuse to maybe call an election to give an excuse not to leave the country. Sorry, I didn't read through that question till the end. There's a couple of different things in there, but I might throw it to you, Richie. What do we know about whether or not the PM is going to Glasgow, and is it his plan to announce a 50% target but not go? What do we know about where that's all up to?
What we know is that we don't know whether he's going or not. He hasn't confirmed, but there's a buzz this morning that he probably will, probably because he's shored up the outlines of a net zero by 2050 plan, which would be enough politically here for him to feel confident enough to go there. When a leader does go to one of these meetings, people are a lot more polite than if he wasn't there. And so I actually think strategically it's probably a good move on his part to go, because he will actually pacify some of the criticism for having traveled around the world and taken this average target. It won't be a 50% emission reduction cut by 2030. That would be ideal. That's what the New South Wales coalition government have put forward. It's what the Victorian Labor government have. ACT's gone harder. Unfortunately, that's not what's on the table. There's rumor that it might be something more in the 30s, and there's also a rumor that it would be a projection rather than a target. The difference there is that a projection is not there's no accountability behind a projection. I mean, if we remember, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg projected that we'd be back in the black. Like, a projection doesn't actually mean anything when it comes to accountability. And that's what's unfortunate. That's why it's great that the New South Wales coalition government locked in that 50% target. They projected that they'll get there, but they locked it in as well so that they can be held to account. And that's what we don't have. Nothing that holds the government to account in the next 10 years for doing anything more than the bare minimum, which is the same target they had 7 years ago, reducing emissions by 26% by 2030. And that's just not good enough.
Yeah, Katharine, back to you on targets. And do you think the PM is going to end up going? Was Prince Charles incredulity?
Prince Charles has forced Scott Morrison to go to Glasgow. No, sadly, I don't think Chuck was the instigator there. Look, I think the reality about the Prime Minister's attendance or not in Glasgow is sort of entirely contingent on where we land, really, over the next couple of days. I think also there's been some pre-management, if that makes sense. I don't think it was his strongest suit with the Nats to be flagging a week ago that he was going to go to Glasgow with a policy that hadn't been agreed on yet. Therefore, it really wasn't in the Prime Minister's interest to be signalling that he would be going to Glasgow. I think the other thing that the Prime Minister would have in mind, apart from the inconvenience of the timing, and by that I mean that he has to go at a time where the lockdown states are coming out of lockdown, and that period is quite politically challenging, obviously, and it's a bad time to be out of the country and in a sustained quarantine in and out of the country. That's in his mind. I also think in his mind is, God, if I actually manage to land this plane with the Nats on board and no casualties, do I then go out of the country and let Barnaby Joyce sell this for 2 weeks? I'm really not sure I want to do that, right? So all of these things have been a thing. Sadly, I think Chuck is not a big instigator of what is happening with Glasgow or not. Anyway, in terms of will he go or not, depends on what happens over the next couple of days. Certainly senior colleagues around the Prime Minister are saying, look, if this is all okay, then it's probably more likely he'll go than not.
Hey, Katharine, do you think there's still any chance of a federal election this year? Because that would rule it out, wouldn't it? If he went, he's in quarantine. Like, I know the betting market's kind of halved a couple of weeks ago. It seems bizarre to me, but if they thought it was going to be worse in the new year, they might still have a crack.
Well, this is why the speculation persists, Pete, that it's that maybe he'll make a dash and try and get a late November election done, because the longer you wait, potentially the worse it gets. So that's why the speculation has persisted, and amongst people who are no dummies. I don't think it can be ruled out. I don't think it can be 100% ruled out. And the political parties of all stripes would be crazy if they're not preparing a contingency to go, because the one certainty of this is the Prime Minister will call an election at the precise moment he thinks they can win. So, but I think, look, on the balance of probabilities, it's more likely to be in the first quarter of next year than this year. But maybe I'm just saying that because I really don't fancy doing an election right now. But anyway, that's the situation as best as I can describe
out there into the world, Katharine.
Yes, exactly.
No
yes. No, thank you. It would be great if they didn't do that to us. But if the Prime Minister thinks he can win, well, that's the dominant thought.
Yeah. The next question is from John Power. He asks, why should farmers be compensated for anti-global heating measures? Surely they will benefit. Richie, I might give this one to you first.
Yep. I mean, everyone benefits from a world that doesn't have dangerous climate change. Like that should go like with the logic of taking action. Unfortunately, it's been overshadowed by decades of being taught that it would be far more costly to take climate action, including, as recently as a couple of years ago in the federal election. Yes, it makes sense that farmers would benefit, much like any industry would benefit, especially ones that are reliant on weather conditions, favorable weather conditions. I think the reason, if I had to guess, why the National Farmers Federation decided to speak up earlier this week is basically in reaction to the mining proponents finding their way into the debate and seeming to overshadow them. They've probably been working behind the scenes with the Agriculture Minister to sort out a whole variety of things, and then suddenly seeing that all blow up maybe led to them taking a more public position. I think the overarching point, though, is that Australia has mismanaged how it manages climate change, leaving many constituents feeling like they've been hard done by. I mean, during the NEG debate a few years ago, the position came out from the Prime Minister that every sector should do about the same amount, which is a 26% emission reduction target. Now, that meant that electricity would get off very easily, but for agriculture, it would be very hard, to the point where they'd run out of ways to reduce emissions and have to cull. Like, if we manage that whole of economy, which is what a carbon price does, then you go ahead and reduce emissions in the easiest places possible. And if we'd organize it properly, that's what we'd be doing, getting to 100% renewable energy, electrifying everything else, transport, industry, stationary energy, and then turning our carbon sinks into carbon forests. That's the priority in the sequence. And if we'd managed it right, we would have done that. And that would have left the sectors that are hardest to abate better off in the end.
Katharine, did you also want to respond to that?
No, I think that's very well explained from Richie in terms of the dynamics. I joked to a colleague that maybe the NFF had BCA and V in terms of, but that was just a joke. Obviously, just a joke. But no, look, I think the NFF are just keen to ensure that the interests of agriculturalists are to the fore in this conversation, because there's been a dynamic with the National Party, particularly in recent years, where they have been much more resources industry focused than on pastoralists and producers. And in terms of, also, I think the sort of starting point for the farm sector has been, well, we'd like a lot of the benefits, but not a lot of the downsides, if that's possible. If we could emerge from this with all of the upsides in terms of the revenue streams and not any of the downsides, like punitive abatement targets or whatever else, that'd be A-OK with us. So I think that's basically what Fiona Simpson was saying, but at a higher level of ambit, by saying, hey, let's have some Kyoto era compensation. Interestingly, though, David Littleproud said very quickly in relation to that, thanks, Fiona, go talk to the states.
Very interesting. The next question is still on the Nats. It's from Katharine Byrne, who asks, is there a concern that the Nats will hold the coalition over a barrel by forcing a knee-jerk rapid response to the social media giants off the back of the disgraceful trolling of one of his daughters? I think that's referring to Barnaby Joyce's daughter. He held a press conference earlier this week. Doesn't our action need to be more considered than this? Pete, I'm going to come to you on this one. The government's actually has quite an appetite to take on big tech, but will they go down this path, do you think?
Look, there's a lot of moving parts here. There was a High Court judgment about 2 weeks ago regarding Dylan Voller, who was the young kid up in the Northern Territory who had been subject to incredible abuse inside an institution. And the High Court case was actually about media companies publishing stories and then landing on the Facebook page, and then horrible comments on the Facebook page. And the High Court actually found the media companies were liable for defamation based on the comments. And that's this really, in a way, an iconic ruling globally, that the platforms, that the publishers are carrying responsibility onto the platforms. The media companies don't like that. And I think there's been a fair bit of activity going on preceding the Barnaby issue, with the media companies saying to the government, you need to sort this out. And then Barnaby's weighed into the middle of this, rightly being outraged at the treatment of his daughter on the platforms. And the proposition is that the platforms will become responsible for the defamation, particularly when it's an anonymous character. That would turn the entire history of the internet on its head. The American laws, the Section 230 exemptions that meant that the internet was never responsible for what it carries. So in this weird and bizarre way, Barnaby is challenging the entire DNA of the internet at the moment. And I'm all for it, just quietly. I think that more regulation is better. Cross-promotion. We're running fortnightly similar to this on technology called Burning Platform that we started to put out as a podcast, and we discussed this in some detail last week, and that's also through the Australia Institute website. So anyway, long story short, you've got that going on. You've got privacy reforms going on in Australia at the moment to work out what data tech companies can take. We've had legislation going through expanding the powers of our e-safety commissioner to force social media companies to take down content. And we've still got the news bargaining code working its way through the system, which is allowing media companies like Katharine's to employ a whole lot more journalists. So on all this government has been quite activist in terms of reining in big tech. And, you know, I continually find myself in the strange situation as someone from the progressive side of politics, but saying kudos to the government on some of these issues. So I'm not sure where the Barnaby bit lands, but it is not insignificant what he's proposing.
Thanks, Pete. And yeah, you can find that podcast, Burning Platforms, and sign up to the fortnightly webinars on the Australia Institute website or on the Centre for Responsible Tech website. Katharine, the next one might be for you. It's from Jay Wilson. As I understand it, on October 18th, Zali Steggall will table a revised draft of her climate change bill to federal parliament. Is there any chance it will be seriously debated?
Sadly not. I don't think so. But one little bit of a moving part that you could tuck into the back of your mind is in the event this goes badly for the Prime Minister this week, in the event that he can't reach agreement from his National Party colleagues to go to Glasgow with a net zero target. Well, I mean, I don't know where to begin to start with that, but let's just say it's possible. Let's just say that the history of the last decade tells us that every time climate policy makes a pass at the high levels of the government, a disaster ensues, either minor or major. So let's just acknowledge the fate gods that, you know, maybe this won't all land beautifully at the end of the week. Now, there's a point to me saying that because something that's been very clear in this pass of climate policy is metropolitan Liberals are sufficiently exercised, either because they actually are economically rational and understand science, or because they fear they're under challenge in their heartland from Zali Steggall-like independence. They have actually raised their voices significantly in this debate in a way that they didn't during the National Energy Guarantee debate, for example. Yeah. So in the event this is a car crash and Morrison says, oh, sorry, actually I can't do net zero because the Nats won't let me, I would not be at all surprised if some Liberals put up their hand to support that bill. I would not be at all surprised.
Just finishing up with a question about the BCA, just because I'm maintaining the rage a bit like Katharine. The next question is from Brian Regan, who says, is it about time for corporate Australia to show they know how to manage and value competence by sacking the BCA executives who have gotten it so wrong on climate for so long? Katharine, to you first, and then maybe a response from Richie.
Oh, look, God, poor Jennifer Westacott. I mean, look, sorry. It's sort of like, guys, we need to understand that, look, the BCA Secretariat, who are the people who put out these reports and front, Radio National and other worthy channels in order to sell the positions of the BCA, are employees of the chief executives of Australia who determine these positions. Like, sort of cleaning out the BCA Secretariat is really not what's going to help us here. It's the corporate mindset of Australian CEOs that is behind the BCA's positioning. So, look, I feel a bit sorry for Jennifer Westacott, who seems a very decent woman. But look, she's the one that's been fronting, all of these ridiculous positions until the current one. So, look, I don't think a clean out at the BCA Secretariat is going to help us much. It's what needs to change is the mindset of corporate Australia. It is changing for the reasons that we've flagged. Let's hope it's permanent.
Richie, anything to add to that?
Just that it's not only is there no accountability, you fail upwards. I mean, the chair of the BCA at the time during the economy wrecking line was Grant King, who then went on to review Australia's climate policies, and which led to carbon capture and storage being shoved down the throats of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and now can get carbon credits. And where did he end up? The chair of the Climate Change Authority. Like, this is what happens when there is no accountability. And this is not the first time the BCA's flip-flopped or U-turned. Like, they said Australia should be leading, and then just turned around 5 minutes later, if I can borrow your term, Merv, and then said, oh, no, Australia shouldn't do anything until 80% of our competitors do something. This is actually like the 5th or 6th U-turn from the BCA, and I think eventually we're going to have to deal them out of the conversation.
And potentially, I mean, the BCA doesn't just represent the mining sector. Perhaps listening to a few different parts of their membership rather than focusing on some elements of it might take them a bit further as well.
Yeah, just very quickly, that's a very important point, is the change in the membership and the composition of those companies who are members of the BCA. I think that's actually the story here.
Yeah.
And also the rise of competing outfits, like the Smart Energy Council has come out of nowhere now and are putting on a big event next week. I think it's just a good sign that people want alternative lobby groups.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks so much for all of your questions, everyone. And thanks to our panelists, Katharine Murphy, Pete Lewis, Richie Merzian, and John Remington. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but as always, we welcome them. And thanks for joining us today. We do have more exciting webinars coming up. Tomorrow, Chris Bowen, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, will be launching our Climate of the Nation report. So please tune in for that. That's from 11 a.m. You can find details for that, all of our Australia Institute research, as well as the Centre for Responsible Tech. All of those things have got a mention today over at our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And don't forget to check out Katharine and Pete's pieces on Guardian Australia today. Well worth a look. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow, if not a fortnight from now. Thanks. Bye.